The deafening sound of thousands of men shouting and shrieking. The clash of weapon on weapon and weapon on armour. The high-pitched screams of panicked warhorses. The metallic tang of blood in the air, so strong that soldiers can taste it as they slip and slide in the mud and gore. If that sounds appealing, let's go back to the Middle Ages and find out why you wouldn't last 10 minutes on a medieval battlefield.
So, you think you know everything about knights, castles, and kings? Well, hold on to your chainmail because we're starting a history channel all about the Roman Empire. Now, I know what you're thinking, wait, Roman Empire, isn't that before my favourite medieval legends? Well, yes, but stick with me. Rome is where it all started. From the fall of the mighty empire to the rise of your medieval knights, it's a story that's all connected. So if you're ready to learn about this incredible time period, join the toga party over at our new channel, The Roman Empire. It's going to be totally worth the detour in your historical journey, so I'll leave a link to it in the description below. And now for today's video, welcome to Medieval Madness.
Are we there yet? It wasn't just the battlefield that saw the chaos and fatigue of an army. Let's not forget that before the soldiers even arrived there, they would have marched for miles and already be exhausted and desperate, depending on the weather, diet, and the amount of sleep that they've had. It's likely that they had already fought in skirmishes on their way to the battle. In wars, there could be several battles, one after another. During the War of the Roses, the important battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury were fought in 1471 with just a 3-week gap. And in 1346, as part of the 100 Years' War, there were 5 battles and a siege in Calais that went on for almost a year. The battles of Blanchetaque and Crécy were only 2 days apart. It's not much time to get yourself together, both physically and mentally, ready for the next clash. Just getting from one place to another could take days. War supplies and food trains had to be moved along with the men. Many men and horses died on the way before they even saw any combat. Some from the cold, others from disease or hunger. The English army who fought at the Battle of Agincourt had landed on French soil in August, and after besieging the port of Harfleur, didn't leave the town until October. By that point, an outbreak of dysentery, which was known as the Bloody Flux among the ranks, had significantly reduced their numbers and weakened many of those who were left. Feel the noise. The noise of a medieval battlefield could be seen as a type of psychological warfare in itself. It's very likely that the hornblower was positioned far away from the fighting at the rear of the men with the leaders. So the soldiers on the front line probably couldn't even hear them blow their instrument to signal the start of the conflict. The English chronicler Thomas Wellingham, who died in the early 15th century, stated that the foot soldiers hardly ever heard the call to advance and moved forward by copying what everyone else was doing. And it's no surprise that no one could have heard either the speechmaker or the horn with all the screaming and shouting that would have been going on. In her Book of the Deeds of Arms and Chivalry, the 14th century poet and author Christine de Pizan advises that, quote, "One should keep the enemy busy with all sorts of assaults so that the sounds, the activity and the noise will keep their bodies as well as their ears occupied, for arrows thicker than flies from crossbows bombards cannon shots, the sounds of trumpets, and the fear will keep them sufficiently occupied." Once on the field and advancing, the goal for a medieval commander was that his frontline troops should reach the enemy in as tightly packed formation as was possible. The soldiers lined up several rows deep and walked together at a brisk pace. They would keep stopping at intervals to close ranks again. They would not have run at the enemy. The goal for a medieval commander was for his men to reach the enemy with enough energy to fight, not to be exhausted from running. Once they were close enough, the foot soldiers would pack tightly together one last time and then hit the enemy with as much force as possible. Sometimes the enemy would be doing the same thing, not standing still. If neither side ran away, then they would clash together and the men would start to attack one another with whatever weapon they had to hand. This could be axes, swords, daggers, fists. One of the formations might break due to the mental pressure and the noise. The psychological stress that these men were under should not be underestimated, especially when you consider that most of the soldiers in a medieval army were not even professionally trained. Some would have just been able-bodied men picked up on the march to the battlefield. If both sides stood their ground, then the fighting could go on for hours, or at least until one side was losing. The Battle of Towton in 1461 during the Wars of the Roses went on for 10 hours in the middle of a snowstorm. Even running away was no guarantee of a reprieve. The real trouble started when one of the armies ran away from the battlefield, pursued and hunted down by the winning side. Wall of Death. Dr. Timothy Sutherland, a battlefield archaeologist, has studied sites such as Towton and discovered that almost 40% of skeletons who stood in frontline positions didn't die from wounds, but from being trampled to death, probably by their own comrades in the panic as contact with the enemy was made. Try and just imagine the chaos all around. The screaming not just from the enemy, but from the men at your side, the ones who are pushing forward with you, shoulder to shoulder. Military historian Richard Holmes found that 3/4 of men placed in an extreme combat situation made involuntary noises that they couldn't even remember making later. Your head frying inside your helmet. You can't breathe properly, and the air that you can manage to gasp in feels wet. Panic is setting with every step forward that you take. You become disorientated. You can smell your own sweat and the body odor and fear of the men on either side. Then, as you reach the enemy at last, having survived coming through a hail of arrows without even receiving a single blow, you fall face down. Others around you fall too. The men behind shove forward with the momentum of the flow of your tightly packed formation. Suddenly, it is your own men who have become the enemy. Some, in an effort not to fall, try to step over you, but they just stumble and collapse. Others behind them suffering the same fate like a set of human dominoes. Unable to get up because of the mass of men from both sides trampling on you with their boots or the enemy stabbing at you, trying to find gaps in your armor, you slowly suffocate in just an inch of mud, unable to see daylight anymore, unable to move or breathe, unable to cry for help, but hearing the screams and cries of the men around you and their groans of pain. The bones of your arms, legs, ribs, and back shattered. Your head kicked and knocked around like a football, your face crushed into the ground. This was the fate of many soldiers at the Battle of Visby in Sweden in 136. Those that did show evidence of having sustained wounds from weapons displayed signs of perimortem trauma as they were lying on the ground, that is, just before death occurred. And every single unprotected part of the body was a vulnerable target for an enemy to strike. A hole in the head. Of course, the head was the main target. At Towton, out of the 28 skulls that were researched, 27 of them had head wounds, suggesting that the men were either not wearing any helmets, or had them knocked off just as they died, or they could have removed them in the heat of the battle. According to historical sources on combat techniques, the head was considered the prime focus of violence. The American medievalist Dr. Kelly DeVries found that most fatal wounds from bodies at French battlefield sites came from downward strikes to the top of the head or in the neck. The chances of swinging a sword around like we see in the movies was very unlikely, there just wasn't the space. The men were packed in so tight that there was minimal room to maneuver, and the most common weapons used were axes, spears, and maces rather than swords. Some soldiers even died standing upright, held there by the pressure of the men around them. Swords took years of training to master, and they were very expensive and could cost more than a month's wages, and were only carried by professional soldiers and nobles. On the battlefield, swords only represented around a quarter of the weaponry. Many farming implements also found their way onto the battlefield. After all, you were just as dead when being decapitated by a rusty old scythe or stabbed with a pitchfork as you were being beheaded by a pricey sword. Some men even resorted to using a sharpened shovel as a makeshift weapon. Dr. Alan Williams, an expert on the history of armour, carried out some research on the temperatures endured inside a medieval helmet and found that within 20 minutes they could be higher than 110 degrees Fahrenheit. French chronicler Jean de Jonville described how several French knights died from the heat and suffocation inside their own armour at the Battle of Mansoura in 1250 during the Seventh Crusade. Run. At Towton, many Lancastrians were killed whilst fleeing. Some were trampled to death by one another trying to get away, others drowned in the rivers. It was said that the waters ran red with blood for many days after, and after it was all over, the victorious army would return to the battlefield to plunder the wounded, the dead, and the enemy camp. Many items were taken to be reused, such as weapons, clothing pins, and buckles. The bodies would also have been stripped of their armour, chainmail, and even clothing. It was undignified, but nothing went to waste. The Bayeux Tapestry, which depicts the 1066 Battle of Hastings, shows an example of this practice. The medieval Latin chronicle Gesta Henrici Quinti, which tells the deeds of King Henry V, famous for his victory at Agincourt, states, quote, "None of them possessed at our departure any more covering than that which nature had endowed him when first he saw the light." German chronicler Bruno of Magdeburg, who wrote his book Historia de Ballo Saxonica in the 11th century, describes the treasures found by the Saxons in the enemy camp after the Battle of the Elster in 1080. There were horses, weapons, gold and silver coins, bars and tableware, as well as tents, which were also of value. Unless a soldier was of importance, like a knight, he would be thrown into a mass grave with the rest on the battlefield. Only high-ranking members were given the dignity of a journey home for burial in a church. Thomas Walsingham wrote about the aftermath of the Battle of Brynglas between the Welsh and the English in 1402. He said that, quote, "After the battle, the Welshwomen cut off the genitalia of the dead, put the member of each dead man in his mouth, and hung his testicles from his chin. They also cut off noses and stuck them up their arses." He does note that this was an unusual and unprecedented crime, and that, quote, "They did not allow the bodies of the dead to be commended to God with the last rites of burial until a large sum of money had been paid." Chivalry and honour were for the songwriters. Surviving a medieval battle didn't take skill or courage. There was hardly ever any heroics on the battlefield, and survival had more to do with luck than anything else. Luck and the willingness to do whatever it took to stay alive. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you enjoyed these videos, as we do release a new one every Friday. So until next time, hope you all have an amazing week. Cheers!